Hey class, welcome back. Today we're going to keep talking about operant conditioning and go on and talk a little bit about what are called reinforcement schedules. So again, just to review operant conditioning, remember this type of conditioning, different than classical conditioning, is interested in getting the subject to increase or decrease certain behaviors. Target behaviors is what we call them. And so with operant conditioning, what you're going to use are positive and negative reinforcements, remember, and reinforcements always increase a behavior, or positive and negative punishments, and punishments always decrease a behavior. Now, scientists got to thinking, well, what are the best ways to utilize those positive and negative reinforcements and punishments such that we can get our subjects to either learn a particular target behavior very quickly or to maintain that target behavior for a long time. And in fact, you can put these two things together, but you generally are going to kind of train for them or condition for them separately. So let's take a look at some of the things that we'll need to be able to put these schedules together. Now, the first thing to understand is the difference between what is called a continuous versus an intermittent schedule. Now, intermittent just means once in a while, and that is what this definition is going to mean, much like continuous means continuously or all the time. So a continuous conditioning schedule is going to be one in which every time the subject performs the target behavior, every time they do the thing that you either want them to do more of or you want them to do less of, you are always going to produce or give them a reward or a punishment. Every time, every time, every time. That's what we mean by continuous. This means that every time they do the thing, you're going to give them the reward if you're trying to increase that target behavior, or you're going to give them the punishment if you're trying to decrease that target behavior. This is in comparison to the intermittent schedule, which means that you don't do it all the time. Sometimes you give the reward when they do the target behavior, and other times you don't give the reward. So as far as the continuous schedule goes, it's pretty simplistic, but when we get to the intermittent schedule, we're going to need to break that down into several different types of intermittent schedules. So some of these you'll see could be a continuous schedule, but most of them are going to be utilized in a way that is intermittent in some way. So let's move on to this next set of words, and again, from here on out, we're mostly talking about intermittent schedules. I'll try to remember to point out the couple schedules here that could be used in a continuous way. But again, most of these are intermittent. And so that's why you see over here when we get to this 4x4, this 2x2, there's no continuous or intermittent because most of them here are going to be intermittent. So let's take a look at a fixed versus a variable schedule. So a fixed schedule just means that when I give this intermittent, and let's say it's intermittent, here's actually one where you could do a continuous. Sorry to start out with a confusing one, but when I decide to give this intermittent, let's say, reinforcement, we'll say we're giving reinforcements here, I'm going to do it on a schedule that happens all the time. When I say all the time, I mean that it happens at the same time, it happens at the same, we would say, interval each time. So let's look at a schedule, for instance. Let's say I'm trying to get my dog to learn how to sit. There's a behavior that I'm trying to get him to increase. That is to say, I'm trying to get him to sit when I say sit. So there's a bit of complexity in there because I don't want him just doing the behavior more. I want him doing it more when I tell him to do it more. But we can simplify it a bit and just say, I want to get my dog to sit, and so I'm going to use a fixed schedule to do that. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that generally I'm going to tell my dog to sit, and then when he sits, I'm going to give him a treat. But what's going to happen here is I'm not going to always give him a treat. So let's say we're doing some type of training session or a conditioning session. Remember, those two words can be used somewhat interchangeably. So let's say we're doing some type of training session, and in the session I'm trying to get him to sit. I've got him here in front of me. Maybe I should have just brought him in, but I've got him here in front of me, and I say, Midas, sit, and he sits, and then I give him a treat. and then I have him stand up or lay down or wander off or whatever, and then I say Midas sit, and this time when he sits, I don't give him a treat. And then the next time I say sit, and that time I give him a treat, right? So in this fixed schedule, I'm not giving him a treat continuously. I'm not reinforcing him continuously, but I am reinforcing him on a fixed schedule. And what does this schedule look like? Well, it looks like every other time he does the target behavior, I'm going to give him a treat. So he sits, I give him a treat. He sits, no treat. He sits, I give him a treat. He sits, no treat. Sits, treat, sits, no treat. And on and on and on. So what's fixed about this schedule is that I'm always giving him a treat every other time he sits. So in a fixed schedule, I'm not giving it to him every time, but when I am giving it to him is fixed. That is to say, in this case, it's every other time. Now, I could do something different and give it to him every fifth time. I guess it's every fourth time, but I could give it to him every fourth time as well, right? And this is still a fixed schedule, right? Again, so what makes it fixed is that I'm always using the same space between. I'm always using the same amount of times or the same interval between times. I'm always using that same amount of time, that same number of times before I give a reward or a punishment, okay? So the fixed schedule can be intermittent. This is one, of course, where it could be continuous, right? I could give him a treat every time, and that would still be a fixed schedule, right? Because it's still fixed at 1. But what we're talking about is a schedule generally that's going to be an intermittent and fixed schedule, or I'm not giving it to him every time, but I am giving it to him regularly on some sort of fixed schedule. So the next type of reinforcement that we can look at is what's called a variable schedule. In a variable schedule, unlike the fixed schedule, I'm going to give it to him intermittently. And here's one where necessarily the schedule will be intermittent. But I'm going to give him a treat intermittently. But that intermittent treat is going to be random. So the first time that he sits, I give him a treat. The next time he sits, I don't give him a treat. The next time he sits, I don't give him a treat. The next time he sits, I give him a treat. And then the next time he sits, I don't give him a treat. And the next time he sits, I give him a treat. And then the next time he sits, I give him a treat. Don't give him a treat, don't give him a treat. Don't give him a treat, give him a treat. Okay, so you see here that this is definitely intermittent because I'm not doing it every time. And in fact, if I'm doing a variable schedule, I couldn't do it every time. I couldn't do a continuous variable schedule, then I wouldn't be varying anything. So the thing about the variable schedule is of course, that I'm varying when I give him the reward. I'm varying what target behaviors I'm going to reinforce or punish. So here you see I don't necessarily give it to him on any particular fixed schedule. Instead, I give it to him on a variable schedule. So fixed just means that the intervals in between are the same, whereas variable means that the intervals between are different, they change. Now I may plan that ahead of time and say, well, I'm going to do 4, then I'm going to do 2, then I'm going to do 1, then I'm going to do 4 again. Or I might just do it randomly. It might just be when I remember, or it might just be, I say, okay, now seems like a good time, it's been a while. So this variable schedule just means I'm moving things around, that they aren't fixed. So let's look at this other set of words, and this one can be a little bit complicated. One, because of the language I'll have to use to talk about it, and that word is the difference between number of times and amount of time. Okay, again, I know that's confusing, and over the years I've been trying to figure out a better way to explain that, but that's what I've come to is we're going to think about the difference between number of times and amount of times. For the most part, so far, we've really only been talking about this ratio schedule. And the ratio schedule is interested in number of times, number of completed successful target behaviors. And so in a ratio schedule, what I'm looking for is, did they do the thing? And when they did the thing, I either make a checkbox or maybe I treat them that time, but at least I'm noting that they did it. Each time they do it, I'm noting. And so I may be counting for some type of fixed or even a variable ratio schedule, but what I'm looking for is, even if I'm doing variable, right, I need to know after 2, I'm going to treat him again. And then after 1, I'm going to treat him again. And then after 0, that is to say the next one, I'm going to treat him again, right? So I need to know that they're doing them. I need to be able to count the number of times that this person or the subject, the dog in this case, is completing those successful target behaviors. So remember that ratio is about number of times. I'm stressing that because when we get to interval here, what we're talking about is amount of time. And so in an interval schedule, I'm not looking for successful completions necessarily. I'm still looking for them, but I'm not counting them. What I'm really interested in is, will you do the thing at all within a given time limit? So what does this look like? And I'll use my dog again as an example. So, and this is something that I don't necessarily work with him on. This isn't something I necessarily train him with, but it's just something that I've noticed as an interaction between the two of us. So I leave my dog outside, usually when I'm home most of the day. He likes to be outside rather than just sitting around with me inside. But he does like to be inside sometimes, certainly if it's raining or if it's he really hates the wind. So for all sorts of reasons, he might just want to come hang out inside even during the day. And so he doesn't do anything where he kind of scratches on the door, or he doesn't even really bark. Sometimes he'll whine if he is really interested in coming in. That's usually if somebody's in the house that he knows, he can recognize their voice, he'll want to come see them. But generally he is just kind of chill to be either inside or outside. But if he kind of wants to come inside, he'll usually wait by the door. He'll usually just kind of hang out by the door and wait for me to open it. So here's where this interval piece comes in. So generally, when I'm trying to figure out if my dog wants to come inside, I'll just check at different times. I'll go to the door, I'll open the door, I'll call his name, Midas, and I'll give him a few seconds. And if he doesn't come running into the door, then I expect he doesn't want to come in, and so I close the door. Well, what I've done there is I've set up an interval. I've set up a reinforcement interval of 5 seconds. So unlike when I'm trying to get my dog to sit and I just say sit, and in that case, I might give him an indefinite amount of time to do that. I'm probably going to limit it to some degree, but generally I'm looking for, did he do it or not? And that's mostly what I'm registering. But here I've set up something a little bit different. Because now what happens is when I open the door and I call his name, he's got 5 seconds to respond to that behavior, right? Supposedly, right? I don't necessarily wait exactly 5 seconds, but something like that, right? So I open the door, Midas, 5 seconds, and then I leave and I close the door and I go back to whatever it is I was doing. And so he's got this interval, he's got this amount of time to get to the door if he wants to come inside. If he doesn't get to the door in 5 seconds, right? Let's say he gets to the door at second 6. Well, in that case, he doesn't get, in this case, coming inside would be his reinforcement. In this case, he doesn't get that reinforcement, right? He missed the interval. So if he shows up within the 5 seconds, try to let him inside, and when he comes to chill. But if he comes at second 6, and let's say I'm cruel, and even if I hear him show up at the door, I don't let him in at that time. well then he doesn't get the reward. And so the interval schedule is about setting up a designated interval of time in which the subject has an opportunity to complete the desired behavior. In lab experiments, this might look like flashing on a red light, and if at the time that the red light is on, the mouse presses some lever, right, he'll get a food reward, he'll get some type of treat. Versus a ratio schedule, which would be every time he presses the lever, he gets a treat, or every 4 times he presses it, he gets a treat, right? In an interval schedule, it's only allowable within this certain amount of time. So when the light is on, let's say the light's on for 5 seconds, if the mouse presses the lever within that 5 seconds, he'll get the treat. If he misses it by too long, or if he even presses it too early, that is to say, he presses it before the light comes on, or if my dog shows up before I show up to open the door, right? There's no opportunity here for them to get that treat. So the interval schedule is about setting up an interval of time, an amount of time in which the subject has to complete the task. And if they do, well then they get the reward or they get the punishment, right? But after that window closes, then they're no longer able to earn that, right? And again, that's different from the ratio schedule, where theoretically, if I ask my dog to sit and I'm just gonna wait until he does it or doesn't do it, right? And then I'm gonna move on to the next trial. I'm not gonna necessarily say, well, you've got 5 seconds to sit. No, I'm just gonna give him however long he takes, or if I just know he's not gonna do it, then I move on to the next thing. I might just say sit again, or I might try a different trick. All right, so from these 4 sets of words, or these 2 sets of 2 words, we can again create one of these 2x2 matrices and think about the different types of schedules altogether that we can have. Again, thinking about continuous is maybe one other type that sort of has a Venn diagram, it fits on some of them, but it's also its own thing. So here we've got a fixed ratio schedule. If you can't see this, it says fixed along the top, fixed and variable, and then ratio and interval along the side. So here we've got a variable ratio schedule. We've got a fixed interval schedule, just out there, and we've got a variable interval schedule. Okay, so here are 4 reinforcement schedule types. Fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Again, just using these 4 sets of words to think about what those 4 schedule types are. So, what's the fixed ratio schedule look like? Let's go through each of them and think about this. The fixed ratio is probably the most simplistic one, and I've already given you a pretty good example of how that might look. So that's just the type where I tell my dog to sit, and in a fixed way, every time he accomplishes that, I give him a reward, right? So that's the one where every time he does the thing, every time he does the target behavior, I give him a reward, either every time, or every other time, or every 3rd, or every 5th, or every 100th time, right? As long as it's fixed. He does the thing, and immediately following that, I give a reward. The variable ratio is the other type that we talked about with trying to train my dog to sit. And in this case, I just vary when I will give him a reward, right? Still after a completed behavior, so 1 time sitting, nothing, 2nd time sitting, treat, 3rd time sitting, treat, 4th time nothing, 5th time nothing, 6th time treat, 7th time nothing, right? And so here I'm still looking for that target behavior to be completed and then immediately dispensing that reward to the dog on a varied ratio schedule, okay? So again, these two are both the ratio schedules. They're each looking for the animal, the subject, to complete the behavior at a particular time, and then immediately giving that reward when the successful completion occurs. So let's look at these interval schedules, however. I'm looking for my eraser. So in a fixed interval schedule, similarly, the amount of time is always going to be fixed, but it's always going to be an interval. So the way I described letting my dog in, or getting my dog to show up when I call him at the door, could be a fixed interval schedule. Right? Let's say every time I go to the door, I give him 5 seconds, and the interval between times I go to the door, these are gonna be confusing, is 1 hour. So every hour I go to the door for 5 seconds and see if Midas is there, or if he'll respond to my call. If he is, he gets to come in, right? So this would be a fixed interval schedule, right? There's a fixed amount of time between when I check, and there's a fixed amount of time of how long he has to do the behavior. So you can see that this could change up in several different ways. I could vary the amount of time that I wait for him to come to the door. I could vary the amount of time that I wait between going to the door. Both of these ways would be ways to introduce some variability or some varied intervals into this schedule. Now, for a completely variable interval schedule, right, we might do something like this, where the first time I wait for 5 seconds, and then I wait for 30 minutes before going back and calling him, and this time I only wait for 2 seconds, and then I wait another 30 minutes, and this time I wait for 15 seconds, and then I wait 2 hours, and then I wait 3 seconds, and then I wait 30 minutes, and I wait 5 seconds for him to show up, and then I wait an hour before checking again, right? So again, these hills are about, how long I wait before checking again, and the valleys represent how long I'm actually waiting there at the door for him. So here we have a truly variable interval schedule, right? Because you can see that not only am I varying how long I will wait for him, but I'm also varying how long between I show up to check it all. So again, this is about an amount of time. These are both about amounts of time. In a fixed variable schedule, right, that amount of time is always the same. In a fixed interval schedule, the same time always occurs. And then in a variable interval schedule, you can see that the amount of time can change, either between the time that you would actually do the event, or how long the event itself takes. Okay, so thinking about these, the next question that we might ask ourselves is, well, what's the value in learning each of these types of schedule? What's the value in using them? Do they have some benefit, or do they have some detriment to using one over the other? So let's take a little bit of a look at that. But first, I just want to show you something that I find interesting related to this schedule and how reinforcement seems to work in our brain. So let's say that, again, I'm using my dog as a research subject here, and I am tracking on the bottom time. So just, maybe this is a 1 session event of me trying to get him to sit. So this might be, 10 seconds total. And then on the vertical axis here, what I'm tracking is dopamine level. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in your brain. It's mainly responsible for allowing us to feel pleasure. Anything that you do that's pleasurable, whether it's eating or whether it's having fun or play a video game or whatever it is that you in doing drugs, anything that is pleasurable to your body lets you know about pleasure via dopamine. So dopamine is the thing that happens when we feel good about something, when we feel pleasure about something, when we feel excited about something. Okay, and so dopamine is a way that even though we can't ask a dog how happy did you get, and even sometimes human subjects aren't really good at reporting their own emotions, tracking dopamine is a way that we can see, well, exactly what's going on in their brain and when are they getting excited and when are they seeming to get happy or receiving pleasure. And so what we're interested in here in this little experiment is if I ask my dog to sit, and I will give him a treat if he does it successfully, when is he happiest? When does he have the most dopamine show up in his brain in this little training session? Now, in the class I usually poll, right? And some folks will tell us it's when he sits. A lot more folks will tell us, some folks will tell us when I tell him to sit, which is this first line. Other folks will tell us it's when he sits, which is the second line. And then other folks will say, well, maybe it's when he gives the treat, when he gets the treat, it's that third blue line here. So here's actually what happens. You tell your dog to sit, right? So he's at baseline, he's just hanging out. And you tell him to sit, and you start to see this spike in dopamine. And then the dog sits. Now, this could be the highest point, and maybe it's headed towards the highest point here, but what we see is that when the dog sits, we get this incredible spike. And then, if he gets the treat, we see it level off a bit. So we've got these 3 times that we're looking at, and again, what you see is that the moment after the behavior is successfully completed, that's actually the moment when we get the highest spike in dopamine. That's actually the moment when we feel, in this case the dog, feels the most excited, and it's actually what we call anticipation, right? It's that moment of, I might get something good right now. Something awesome might happen. Right? Think of something good that you've gotten or that's happened to you, and if you pay attention, often what you'll notice is that you seem to be the most excited. You're actually the most happy about it right before you get it, or right before you open it, or right before you do the best part, right? And so it's because this anticipation, turns out it feels actually better than the thing itself. Now you see it leveled off a bit here, but it didn't go down, right? There wasn't any sense of, oh, well, the treat's here, that sucks. But it didn't go up any higher, right? And it didn't even stay straight across. What we find out is that it is that moment of anticipation that seems to be the most exciting. What's also neat about this is that we can also look what would happen if I didn't treat the dog. So we have this same tracking. I hope you can see this orange marker. And so the dog sits, he again has that anticipation because he knows that he's done the thing successfully. But then if I don't give him a treat, right? So maybe this is one of those interval schedules, right? Where I'm doing it every other time. And so here, the time where he doesn't get a treat, what we see is a sharp drop in dopamine. You still get that spike, which is interesting. You still get that anticipation. But then when you don't get it, what does that feel like, right? Think about a time when you almost got something, or when somebody was gonna give you something, or you were gonna get a job, or you were gonna get accepted, right? You just knew it. It's coming, I'm gonna get that thing, and then you didn't get it, right? That feels worse generally than if you hadn't got it at all, and it's because you're feeling the sharp contrast in hopefulness and then your heart sinks, right? It actually turns out that this is a very successful, a very useful, honestly, punishment, right? This feels like a punishment to us when we don't get the rewarded behavior. Not in such a way that it would necessarily stop the behavior from occurring. What actually happens is something that we call it's called a non-associative type of learning, where generally what's going to happen is that the dog is going to try to sit better, at least for a little while, before perhaps he learns that you're just not going to ever give him a treat again. Generally what we have is called a non-associative response. We didn't talk about this type of learning, but in this case, right, the dog becomes a little more sensitive. Okay, maybe I have to sit sooner, maybe I didn't do it right, maybe he didn't like where my paws were, right? So the dog is probably going to become a little bit more vigilant before giving up completely if, after hundreds of trials, let's say, you never reward the dog for doing that again. And it doesn't always have to be the same reward, right? Once the dog has learned to sit, the occasional good boy will do, right? He still associates that with a positive reinforcement, and so he will still enjoy that versus if you tell him to sit and then you walk away, right? What the hell are you doing? Unless you come back with a treat. So the reason that this is important is because it can help us understand which of these schedules is best for both maintaining and which of the schedules is best for learning new behaviors. It turns out that the fixed ratio schedule is going to always be the best one for learning new behaviors, especially for subjects that you can't talk to. So for children, really young children who either can't talk at all or just can't understand you, and certainly for animals, and certainly for plants, right? Anytime you can't really talk to somebody and explain what you're doing, rewarding them at a regular pace. It doesn't even necessarily have to be continuous, though. If you do a continuous schedule, they're going to learn it very fast. We'll talk about in a second here why that may be problematic. But anytime you can do it in a way that the subject can gain some expectation of, okay, if I do this twice, I'm going to get this reward. If I do this 4 times, I'm going to get this reward, right? And because of that, this allows for the subject to learn that behavior the quickest. The drawback to this fixed ratio schedule is that it requires continuous maintenance. If you train the animal, if you train the subject that you're going to get a reward every second time, or you're going to get a reward every third time, or certainly every time, well, they come to expect that reward every second time, every third time. What this means is, once there's been a few trials, once there's been a few times where they haven't gotten that reward when expected, they're very likely to pull back on the behavior. They're very likely to stop doing the thing that you've been training them to do. And in the case of reinforcement, they're very likely to stop doing what you want them to do. If you're doing a punishment schedule, they're very likely to start back doing what you were asking them or you're trying to get them not to do. So the fixed ratio schedule, great for getting the subject to learn quickly, but not very good for maintenance, because you have to always continue to give that reward when they expect it, or they're going to stop doing the desired behavior. So the other type of schedule that is really helpful to think about is the variable interval schedule. It turns out that the variable interval schedule is the best schedule for getting a subject to maintain behavior over a long period of time. And a great thing about the variable interval schedule is that they'll even maintain this behavior in the absence of the scientist or whoever it is that's trying to condition or train them. They will continue to do this usually for a long period of time, even without being rewarded. So why is this? This is because in the variable interval schedule, what I basically do is I set up an amount of time in which you can complete a behavior, but that amount of time and the windows between those amount of times will change, and they'll be random, at least as far as the subject is concerned. So what this causes is a kind of persistence, a kind of vigilance of, well, if I really want to come inside, right? If my dog really wants to come inside and it's pouring outside and it's thundering and lightning and it's windy, right? He hates the wind. If it's windy outside and he really wants to come inside, well, he's gonna wait by the door for a very long time, because he knows that I only check that door every so often, right? Every hour, every 30 minutes, every couple hours. And so he knows that if he misses that window, if he misses that opportunity to come in, he's gonna have to wait another hour before he even gets the opportunity. So what this causes is a certain vigilance of, well, I better always be doing the thing, right? If I want the thing, I better always be doing it. So another example I tend to give in class is thinking about trying to get, let's say you've got a kid and you're trying to get your kid to keep his room clean, right? If you set up that fixed ratio schedule that is, hey, Billy, every time you clean your room, I'll give you $10. Well, eventually that's probably gonna work pretty quickly, and Billy's gonna know what you're wanting out of him, and he's gonna clean his room, at first a few times, but now Billy's gonna eventually learn, well, if I don't want any money, then I probably won't clean my room, or if Dad says he doesn't have any money, then I'm definitely not cleaning it, because, that's what I'm doing it for. I know that every other time I'm supposed to get money. So if he doesn't have money that second time, or if he tells me, or if I don't get it, right, that's gonna discourage me from doing it anymore. So, but what if I put him on a variable interval schedule? Well, what would this look like? This would look like I show up at random days of a week and I check his room. Is it clean? One week I check on Friday, one week I check on Monday, one week I check on Saturday, one week I check on Tuesday, right? And I just randomly check his room. Hey, is it clean? Hey, if it's clean, I'll give you $10. Okay? And so because he doesn't know when I'm gonna show up, because he doesn't know how often I'm gonna show up or what day. So with a variable interval schedule, right, the kid would be most likely to just keep his room clean, right? He'd just be vigilant to me showing up. He doesn't know when that's gonna happen. He doesn't know how often it's gonna be between times. And so he's just gonna try to keep that room clean, versus, again, with the fixed ratio schedule, that would be a situation where he would just clean it when he wanted money. Right? He knows if I clean my room twice today, Dad'll give me some money, or if I clean it 3 times, right? He knows the schedule, he knows the ratio, and he knows he just needs to perform the behavior, versus what I'm really interested in, right, is him keeping it clean, this kind of vigilance, this maintenance of his room. And so this schedule, again, turns out to be the best one for maintenance. Briefly on the other ones, the variable ratio schedule. This schedule actually is really good for continued behavior. If you want the subject to just do something as much as possible, then a variable ratio schedule tends to be the way to go. Why is that? Well, because in a variable ratio schedule, you know that the reward is connected to you doing the behavior. You know that if I keep doing this thing, eventually it's gonna pay off. Well, this makes you want to just continuously do the thing. This makes you want to just continuously do that behavior, such that eventually it will pay off. Well, what does this look like in the real world? Well, it looks like slot machines. With a slot machine, right, you put your money in, you pull the lever, and eventually, if you could pull that lever, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, eventually it would give you some money. You'd win some money back. But you don't know when that is, and so because of that, you just keep pulling the lever. You just keep pulling the lever, maybe this time, nope, maybe this time, nope, maybe this one time, nope, right? And so it causes this type of continued incessant behavior because you don't know when it's gonna pay off. We've found that if we hook up a diode into a mouse's brain, and it basically just releases pure dopamine into the brain, which feels mostly like an orgasm, right? It's just pure pleasure poured directly into your brain. And if we hook a mouse up to a lever that allows him to control that this will produce this feeling in his brain, but we put it on a variable ratio schedule. That is to say, the mouse doesn't know how many times he has to press that lever for the dopamine to be dispensed. He just knows that if he keeps pressing it, eventually it will happen. It turns out that these mice will press that lever to death. They won't eat, they won't drink, they'll just press this lever because they're not sure when they're going to get that next hit. Now, again, as I've said, dopamine is connected to any type of pleasure. Generally, we think of that kind of most direct route. Now, you can obviously just do things, that'll give you dopamine, but the most direct route generally is some type of narcotic. And so this is basically what's happening with drug addicts, right? They don't know. They do know when they're going to get that next feeling, but because they're always chasing it, because they're always chasing that very extreme feeling, sometimes that can lead to addiction, and that's what we see in those mice. They get addicted to the dopamine, and so they keep pressing the button. Which one I talked about? The fixed interval schedule, this one's going to be also somewhat good for maintenance of behavior, but also somewhat good for learning. It's kind of a nice blend. You're still not going to really be able to use this too effectively with any creature, any subject that isn't speaking, because you often need to set up, you often need to explain, hey, at the end of this time period, I'll give you a reward. Or if you have done this within this time period, at the end of that period, you're going to get a punishment, right? And because if the subject can't kind of put A with B, they don't know why, a day later, a week later, they got rewarded, or a week later, they got punished. Sometimes it can be tricky for the learning to happen. But it's going to be much better than the variable interval in terms of learning, because there's some regularity. Okay, this keeps happening every week, every day, whatever it is. And so an example of this might be something like a paycheck, of course, right? So you go to work for 2 weeks or a month or however long your pay period is, and if you do your successful work within that period, well, then you're going to get paid. And so this type of interval schedule is going to help for folks who is going to be best for committed regularity, right? Not kind of frantic regularity, but a regularity. I'm just going to keep doing it because it does seem to always pay off, right? But not in such a way that I can just control it, right? I'll go press the lever when I'm hungry. This is, well, I've got a week to get this done, or I've got to do this much within the week, so I better just get to it. Okay, so that's it for these. I don't have any videos this week that I think would be especially helpful. If you've got some, leave them in the comments. If I think of anything before I post this, I'll leave them in the description. Next week, I think we're talking about human development. I could be wrong, and I'll see you then.